Hello. So in Photoshop, we are going to merge together the frog and the orange. So this is going to be a practice in blending. So we want to have a little bit more finesse with this activity. So on the Google Classroom, you're going to see a frog and a mandarin. You're going to download both of them, and then we'll get started. So first thing we need to do is we need to get the frog into the same document as the orange. So I'm going to unlock this layer, and then I'm going to use my move tool or the V on my keyboard, and I'm going to move Mr. Frog into the same file as my orange. So now your layers should look like a background layer and the frog. Previously, when getting rid of a background, I've had you guys add a layer mask and then make a selection, but this time we're going to do it a little bit differently. So I want us to make our selection first using the magic wand tool. Sometimes Photoshop just needs a minute to load. And then I'm going to click on all of the white spaces on my frog. And then I'm also going to get this part as well. So when I click on the white space that goes around my frog, it doesn't get this part here that's a shadow because it's technically a different color, right? So the magic wand tool sometimes isn't as smart as we want it to be. So let's go ahead and go with our quick selection tool. And we're going to click into that shadow space to add to the selection. And with your quick selection tool, if there's a little plus sign on the inside, that means you're adding to your selection. So we're just going to add that. And then if you select too much, so on the frog's leg here, I got too much of it, you could hold Alt, and then your plus sign turns into a minus sign, and you could get rid of part of the selection. So your little marching ants right now should go around your frog and around the square of the outside of the frog. However, when we make a mask, if I were to click on the layer mask option right now, it's going to fill in everything that is not selected. So because we have the background selected, it kept that as white, and it made the frog black so that it's like a hole, right? And we want the opposite to happen. So what I'm going to do is invert my selection. So when you invert something, that means you're kind of turning it inside out. You're like getting the opposite. So we're going to do Control Shift I. And your marching ants should go from just the background to the frog. And then when we make our mask, it's going to cut out that frog, right? So basically, those little marching ants selected everything that's around the outside of the frog when we first made our selection. And then when we inverted it, it selected just the frog. So that is what the selection was. So when I clicked on the layer mask, it made a hole, or it cut out everything that was not selected. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to move this frog so that he lines up better with the orange. But before we do that, we're going to change the opacity to be a little bit less so that I can see through him. And then I'm going to use my move tool or the V on my keyboard. And I want to do a free transform. So remember, the hotkey for that is Control T, and you get those little bounding boxes that show up. And then we're going to do a couple things. We're going to make him a little bit bigger, and we're also going to rotate him a little bit so that the back of the frog lines up with the curve of the orange, right? So once we've done this, then we press Enter to save, and we can change the opacity back to 100. And then now we're going to continue to edit that layer mask. So I'm going to go with my brush tool or the B on my keyboard. I can use my brackets to make it larger on my keyboard. And then I want to change a couple of things about my brush. So last time we talked about the hardness of the brush, how if you make it 0% hardness, that means that it's soft. So if I bring that hardness up in any way, then it's going to have a really harsh edge instead of having a soft edge. I'm going to leave it at 0% though. And then the opacity is something we can also change for our brush. So the opacity is at 100% right now, which means it's 100% opaque, which means we cannot see through it. But if I change this opacity to be less, then that means it would be 60% opaque, which means it's 60% solid and 20% see-through. So the lower that percentage goes, the more see-through it becomes, right? So I'm going to put it somewhere like 60. And then we can also adjust the flow. So think of flow as like the amount of paint on your brush. So the amount of paint, like how much is coming out at a time, right? So if I wanted to change that, I could change that too. So now, if I paint on my frog, I'm going to paint with black, because if I paint with white, it's going to put the picture back, and that's not what I want. I want to paint with black so that I can remove his legs. So I'm going to get rid of his legs here. Because we changed the opacity and the flow, it's going to take a little bit of time to remove the entire leg, but you're going to get a really soft transition, which is good. I'm going to go ahead and remove these guys. So I do not want to see any more of the legs. Like the legs should completely disappear. And I also don't want to see any of like the crease where the legs were attached. And then one place where I can make a really harsh edge is where his like chin, I don't know if frogs have chins, but it's like the bottom of his mouth, right? So I want to make a harsh selection there. So I'm going to go with my polygon lasso tool, and I'm going to zoom in so I can see better. And I'm just going to make a selection here that goes along the bottom of his little mouth and around this, whoops, around the bottom of his mouth, and then around his hand right here. And then once I've made that selection, now when I paint with my paintbrush tool, it's gonna be like a harsh line where the selection is right here, but that's perfect. That's exactly what I want right now, right? So I want it to be a harsh line on the bottom of his chin. And then to get rid of that selection, we're gonna do Control D, and then we're gonna continue to blend this out. Now, here is the part where students have trouble, okay? What I don't want this to look like is that you've just cut out a frog's head and put it onto the orange, right? I want this to look like we have a frog that's merged into an orange. Like somehow this frog is like radioactive and it's growing out of an orange, okay? So in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're making really soft edits, really minimal changes. So I'm changing my opacity and my flow to be less so that when I come in here and I blend this frog, his spots don't go away, but they do get just a little bit more transparent. Right? So you can see here I'm making small clicks so that it looks like the frog is coming out of the orange. The reason why this works so well is because the texture of the frog, so the way that you could imagine that it feels, is similar to the texture of the mandarin, right? And if I feel like I've taken away too much of the frog, then I would just switch my colors here and paint back with white a little bit and bring some of this back. And it might take you a couple of tries to go like back and forth to blend out exactly what you want, but it should look something like this, right? Now, I've run into another problem, and that problem is that my frog is like a yellow orange and my mandarin is like a red orange, right? So I need to change his color. So with my frog selected, I'm going to come down here to the bottom of my layers and look for like a circle that's half white and half black. And that is an adjustment layer. So I want to adjust the color. And if you remember from our color wheel assignment, color is also referred to as a hue, Hue, right? So if I come up here to hue and saturation, then I'm going to get a properties panel that looks like this, which is exactly what I want. And I'm going to change the one that says hue. So if I move on this little bar right here, it changes the color, but it changes the color of everything, right? I don't want it to change the color of everything. I want it to just change the color of the frog. So you're going to look for a button that looks like this, where it's like a square with an arrow pointing down, and that arrow pointing down has a slash through it. So what that means is that this layer adjustment is being applied to everything that's underneath the adjustment layer. But I want it to just apply to the frog. So if I click this and then I look back at my layers, you're going to notice that that adjustment layer now has a little arrow on it that's pointing to the frog. So now I'm just going to be changing the color of my frog, and I want to change his color so that he matches. So I want to turn him into like a reddish orange, which that looks pretty good, right? And then in addition to that, I might also need to change the saturation. So saturation refers to how bright or how dull something is. So like how intense it is. And so if I bring the saturation up, he's going to look like more neon. And if I bring the saturation down, he's going to look kind of like grayed out, right? So if I just put that somewhere around here, then he looks like he matches even more. The lightness tab refers to like specifically the whites and the blacks in the image. So if I bring this all the way to the white side, all the whites come forward, and if I bring it to the black side, all the blacks come forward, right? But I don't need to worry about that for this one. I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Okay, so now we're done. So if your frog looks like mine, if it looks like he's merging with the orange and you changed his color and you can still see some of his spots and there's some shiny bits, then you're good.